Hello and welcome back. I am with the wonderful Mark Curtis from Declassified. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you very much for having me.
How did you like your topic today about talking about what's not really seen in the media, what's not being covered, the hidden things that aren't really reported on or talked about too much?
Well, I think this is the most important issue that we face. The fact is that the British media has covered up the UK's role in this genocide. They have covered up the various ways in which Britain has been supporting Israel over the last 19 months. So, for example, there's no mention, as far as I'm aware, anywhere in the corporate media, that Britain has been training Israeli armed forces personnel in Britain during the genocide. There's no mention of that, despite ministers admitting that in Parliament. There's barely any mention even of the spy flights that are going from Cyprus over Gaza, being flown by the RAF in aid of Israeli intelligence. The simplest thing you could possibly find out. Those flights are going almost daily and have been for 19 months. There's hardly any mentions of that in the corporate media. I could go on. The UK has been allowing its airspace to be used to supply weapons to Israel, with aircraft coming from the US, going and landing in Israel, as we revealed at Declassified. No coverage of that, as far as I'm aware, in the mainstream media.
Why do you think that is specifically?
Well, I don't think the role of corporate media is to report the news, and it's certainly not to report anything in the public interest. I mean, these are finance and political corporations that have financial agendas, they want to make money, and they have political agendas, and they basically, their role is to support the establishment. I mean, I think that is the nub of the problem. Whereas independent media should be very different. And I hope that we are. And our starting point at Declassified is we want to challenge the state. We want to challenge the establishment. And that means we need to reveal what they're up to. That means that we don't take press releases from the MOD and write them up as news, which is what journalists do in the corporate media. We don't do that. Our task is to expose what the Ministry of Defence, what the Foreign Office, what the Prime Minister is actually doing in this world. And that's not the primary goal of corporate journalists. They don't want to do that. So that's where the system fails us, and that's why people, I think, should be championing independent media much more.
Do you think this goes back to the idea of people maybe not wanting to reckon with the past of the British Empire? And I know you actually wrote an article about, people keep asking about whether the British Empire was good or bad, but you posed the question, did it ever really end? And tell me if I'm, rephrasing that in the wrong way, about the effect that not only that the British Empire has now, but the fact that we still have, military bases and all these ex-colonies, and about how, so many conflicts in the world right now can be traced back directly to the British Empire. Obviously, Gaza is very obvious, but also, India, Pakistan. Do you think there's a distaste for reckoning with our past, and that's perhaps, I don't know, the public might not have a thirst for it, or even the media establishment itself?
Well, it's interesting when you look at the past. There's quite a lot of critical coverage in parts of the media over the empire going back a couple of hundred years. The kind of the height of the atrocities committed by the British in the 18th and 19th centuries. There seems to be, it's okay to cover those kinds of issues, slavery and so on. But when it comes to British foreign policy over the last 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, that's where there's a lot of silence and a lot of lack of context that comes through in the media. And that's why I wrote that article about the empire never died. So we found at Declassified that the UK has 145 military sites around the world in dozens of countries that probably no one outside the MOD is even aware of. Literally, over 100 military bases around the world. There are intelligence bases on Cyprus and in Oman that the UK government has never admitted to having. GCHQ bases, intelligence, listening in facilities, spy facilities. British journalists seem just uninterested in writing about these things because their goal is not to reveal. Their goal is not to reveal what's really going on. I think that many journalists in the mainstream, their goal is to kind of curry favor with the policymakers, to get access and to be given scoops, to be given stories. And one thing that compromises that access is if you annoy them. Whereas the jobs, to me, the job of a proper journalist is to annoy the hell out of the establishment. I mean, what else is journalism unless you are annoying people in power? That surely is what the public expect the journalists to do. It's very interesting. When you look at TV dramas that depict journalists, they're always depicted as a pain in the arse of the establishment. But that's simply not true in the reality of our media world. Most journalists are far from being critical of the establishment. They're part of it, and they reinforce the policies of the state. I think that's very clear in the case of, say, the BBC. I mean, to me, the BBC is a straightforward propaganda institution most of the time. Its coverage of foreign policy is propaganda. And I think the only people that think it isn't are people that don't know enough, frankly, about British foreign policy. You know, because I think anyone, say, reading our stuff at Declassified, looking at trying to reveal the reality of British foreign policy, if you compare that to what's being reported by the BBC, by the rest of the media, I think they will see a vast gulf in that coverage. So I think that the problem we have is that millions of people are still relying on the corporate media for their information. They're still going to the BBC or Channel 4 thinking that they're being told the truth, that these are public service news providers. And they don't realize, I don't think fully, the extent to which they are being misinformed and disinformed. And that's a real problem. And I think...
Where does that come from, though, specifically? Is it to do with the fact that there are some political appointments at the BBC? Is it to do with how they manage their rules of impartiality? Is it to do with, like, a lack of thirst? Or is it just so ingrained into the establishment that it's just something that's just naturally there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's substantially ingrained into the establishment. I mean, many people are aware of the backgrounds of most journalists. I mean, the private schools, for example, play an enormous role, or have done in the past. Still, a very large percentage of journalists come from a very similar kind of background, and they mainly think the same about things. So they tend to write according to the same kind of framework of analysis. So they don't need to be told, don't write a critical foreign policy, because they simply won't think of doing it, because they won't see that as their role. And I think that they need to be challenged. You know, they need to be challenged by outsiders, because they're certainly not being challenged on the inside. Because I also think that you have to look at the structural role of these institutions. These are corporations. They're news providers second, but primarily they are profit-making institutions. They want to make money, and they have political agendas as well. And that means that compromises. I mean, that compromises what they report on and how they report on it. So there's these systemic issues that underline the failure of the media.
I want to touch on anti-Semitism for a second, because, I don't want to downplay anti-Semitism. It is a real problem. It's a real issue. There are many people out there who are genuinely, to their core, anti-Semitic, or even inadvertently anti-Semitic. And we've seen, over the last few weeks, when we've seen Macron call out Israel, we've seen the UK government, to a small extent, call out Israel, and lots of governments now are starting to, they're not actually taking any action. So far, it's just words. And immediately, the Israeli government have come out and said, yesterday we had Benjamin Netanyahu say that Macron is doing a crusade against the Jewish state. And when those two diplomats or embassy workers in Washington were killed, they immediately came out and was like, this is your fault for calling us out. You're giving Hamas power. Is the media, to an extent, afraid of having that power used against them, the weaponization of anti-Semitism when it's weaponized in the completely wrong way? Or is it, again, to do with that ingrainedness of not being critical of them?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible how the anti-Semitism narrative has become so mainstream and so ingrained in the way that the media is reporting on Israel. I mean, in a way, it's understandable that Israeli leaders, they resort to anything to try and deflect criticism. So you can understand ministers in the Israeli government to say, oh, well, they're just anti-Semitic. But that's nonsense. I mean, what's incredible is how that's taken seriously by elements in the media, as though it's a kind of a legitimate thing, as though anti-Semitism is actually a major structural problem in society, over and above other forms of racism, which I don't think that it is. I mean, what we have is we have a very pro-Israeli media. You know, that's the reality of it. They're basically very supportive of Israel and very sympathetic towards Israel for a whole variety of reasons. And I think that they've played along with this sort of, you know, he must be an anti-Semite if he's criticizing Israel agenda. I mean, it obviously reached its apogee during the Jeremy Corbyn years when virtually every day, it seemed, there were articles linking Jeremy Corbyn with anti-Semitism. And this was a deliberate strategy of those media corporations to undermine the possibility of Jeremy Corbyn becoming a prime minister of the country. The Guardian was actually the worst when it came to that anti-Semitism campaign. It probably was a campaign. It had literally dozens of articles about Corbyn's links to a Labour Party where anti-Semitism was rife. It was really trying hard to smear Jeremy Corbyn with that anti-Semitism slur. I remember that there were 4 articles in the week in the run-up to the December 2019 election as well. So they were really trying hard to prevent Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. And I think the real reason for it is that the British establishment did not want a pro-Palestinian person being the Prime Minister of this country who would actually take on the Israeli state in terms of British foreign policies. So I think that underlies the problem.
Why is that, though, specifically? And I really want to try and get a good answer on this, because people ask the question, why do we support Israel in the way that we do? We've got reports going back years of different parliamentary groups, different organizations saying they've done this, they've done that, they've done all of these crimes. Some people say it's the pressure from the Americans because it's in their interest and we're beholden to them, which I'm sure is part of it. But what's your answer of why do we support Israel in the way that we do after decades of their war crimes, their expansion of settlements, and just everything that they've done towards Palestinians and, you know, other people in the region too?
Well, I think a fundamental reason is that special relationship with the US. I mean, the British want to kowtow to US foreign policy. And they know that this is the most kind of sensitive touchstone issue in US politics, at least before Trump's kind of recent break with Netanyahu in the last few weeks. But for Britain to challenge, in effect challenge US policies over support for Israel is a kind of a red line for Whitehall. So for the UK to come out and take a very strong anti-Israeli stance on something, those Whitehall officials will know that they are risking the whole special relationship. Until recently with Trump. I mean, I do think the situation has changed a bit now. And that's made them completely not want to do that. I think the other thing is that for a large number of years, I mean, really going back over 100 years, Britain has regarded Israel as a kind of asset in the region. It was Britain, obviously, that pronounced this declaration to say that there should be a Jewish state in Palestine.
Balfour Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration, 1917. At the time, there was a significant Israel lobby, a Zionist lobby in the UK, pushing for that. And Britain always saw Israel as a kind of a police state in the region that would kind of carry out British bidding and act as a kind of colonial stooge, really, to police the Middle East and keep it divided, I mean, as per classic colonial policies. And I think that long-standing historical view is still kind of present in some parts of policymakers' thinking. So that combined with the special relationship, I think are very important and go quite a long way to explaining why Britain supports Israel so much. I mean, there are other things as well that, you know, Israel is this kind of a budding market for finance, for trade, for arms, although it's a relatively small market for British arms. Yeah, Britain sees Israel as a kind of partner, strategic ally.
we touched on this before we started talking about how the media covers people like Netanyahu or the Israeli government. I find myself frustrated that when we talk about a character like Trump, obviously, he does command a bigger presence in the world and the media, that, we'll bring up his sexual assault accusations, we'll bring up how many times he's been indicted and been to court, and we always add that context into who he is as a person. When the media speaks about Netanyahu, I wouldn't say, they praise him necessarily, but they forget to add the context that right now he is on trial for bribery and corruption for like 3 or 4 different charges. He's currently being investigated for a separate investigation into Qatar, where they're potentially, they've been interviewed, the investigation is ongoing. Potentially him and his team have taken bribes from Qatar to up their image, and that money has allegedly gone to media people. So we have these like giant, potential conspiracies. We've got him on trial, and then you've got people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir calling for ethnic cleansing every other week. And then David Lammy gets up a few weeks ago in Parliament and does his speech, which I'm sure you watched, saying, "Oh, this has gone too far." When Smotrich is now using the word ethnic cleansing, and I was sat there, I was like, he's been saying that for like 2 decades. How do we hold the politicians accountable when they're talking about Israel, and also journalists who forget to add the context in of who this government is, what they've done, what they represent, and how they're using their position to stay in power to help themselves?
Yeah, it is incredible, as you say. I mean, there is a fundamental lack of context. And of course, to add to those crimes of Netanyahu is the very fact that he's wanted for crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. I mean, that's quite an amazing thing when it comes to Britain's ministers continuing to deal with a government when the head of the government is wanted for crimes against humanity. I mean, you would have thought that would be in every news report, but it's so often ignored. I mean, the lack of context goes way back. I mean, before Gaza, before the 7th of October 2023, it was very common for news reports on the occupied territories and Gaza, not even to mention that they were occupied territories, as though this was just already in Palestine, if you like, and it was a conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, rather than the fact that Gaza had been occupied and blockaded for years. People were starving. It was an open-air prison. That kind of context, that's important. And that also is important in the context of what Hamas did on the 7th of October 2023. You can't understand the conflict without that kind of background. Going back several decades, you also cannot understand the conflict without understanding the Nakba of 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were driven out of Palestine to make way for the Israeli state. I mean, that's significant because people are living with those consequences. That people are living with refugees, living as refugees from that time. It's not regularly the case that those things are reported in the British media, and so the public is denied that relevant context. And I think the reason is journalists don't want to explain that context. They're just not interested in telling the truth. They're interested more in promoting a narrative which accords with the priorities of the state. And basically that is a pro-Israeli narrative.
Is there anyone or any organization which you would class as like in the mainstream who you think at all has done a relatively good job or a somewhat good job? Or are they pretty much at this point all complicit in not giving the correct narrative or not adding the right context?
No, I mean, I think we have to go to independent media. If you read Middle East Eye, if you read Middle East Monitor, read Declassified, 1 or 2 other publications, I think that there's very good coverage and analysis in those places. There are 1 or 2 journalists in the mainstream who occasionally write half-decent articles, and occasionally, even on the BBC, you get material that challenges the narrative. I mean, Louis Theroux's The Settlers documentary recently is one of those examples. That will be this decade's BBC contribution to understanding the war in the occupation of the West Bank. There probably won't be another program like that for another 10 years. I mean, it really is that sporadic, if you ask me. It's very rare.
Well, the last one was 10 years ago, wasn't it? Yeah, it was Louis Theroux's. It was like 2012 or 2013.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. There simply is there's no regular critical independent reporting at all. So yeah, we have to go to independent media, and no, there's not a great deal of optimism that I have that the mainstream media can be reformed. I think we should be challenging the mainstream media. I think we should be exposing them and telling people that they are being misinformed and disinformed if they're relying on the mainstream media for information.
And when it comes to the stories that come out of Gaza or the West Bank or the occupied territories, how do we get that information out to people? Because obviously in independent media, it is harder to get that information out there. When I scroll through Declassified and I'm like, oh God, I missed that story. How do we, because it's not just a simple like, oh, just share it on Twitter, just share it in a message. Like, what else can we do to be getting these stories out there and sharing them and talking about them in a way that is going to get the truer message out? Because it is a struggle, and I'm just curious how you do it as well.
Well, this is a question that I spend a lot of time thinking about. How do we do it? Because the corporate media have massive platforms. You know, obviously, they have millions of readers in print and online, declining in print, but nevertheless, large numbers of readers. The BBC, I think, has the biggest audience in the world, and literally over 10 million readers, and it might even be way more than that. Compared to them, independent media like us are drop in the ocean. I think that all we can do is keep doing what we're doing. I think we need to be clever and strategic about how we use social media to reach more and more people. I think we probably need to work together and reinforce kind of each other and amplify the messages and the articles and the videos that other independent media do. And then the other thing, which I will repeat, is I think we need to be challenging that mainstream media and telling as many people as possible that you are not being told the truth by reading the BBC, by watching Channel 4, by reading The Guardian. And over time, I think we will build up a much bigger audience. And obviously 20 years ago, there was basically no independent media. It was a very different landscape then. Now I think that there's a large percentage of the public, I think it might be 30, 40% of people who regularly go to social media as their primary source of news information. That's a very different situation than, say, 20 years ago. And I think over time, the more and more people realize just how insidious the corporate media is, and that is happening. The more people realize that, the more they will turn to independent media. I mean, I take great faith and encouragement from the fact that trust in mainstream media is at an all-time low. To me, that is a massive opportunity. People are right. People are realizing in larger numbers than ever how useless the mainstream media is. I think that's a great opportunity for independent media to fill that gap.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I'm just scared of those people who end up going to the wrong type of independent media. You know, you get the people who might call themselves, independent journalists or citizen journalists in ways and in spaces like X, which have become, dangerous. We need to make sure that we're signposting people to, away from the mainstream, but also saying this person is an expert, look at their record, because there is so much misinformation and disinformation out there, obviously in the mainstream, but there's a part of me that, I don't know if it's controversial, I don't know under this conversation, I would rather have some people watching the mainstream versus what some people are now consuming online in terms of, people being radicalized. But that's a tangent. What I want to ask you is about the context of the coverage of Israel specifically. How do we now take advantage of this kind of turn that we've seen over the last few weeks? It feels like the media's being given permission almost to be a little bit more critical or platform people who are a little bit more critical now that the UK government and France and Canada and other countries are saying, oh, this has now gone too far, even though I would have said that a long time ago. How, is it up to someone like yourself to take any opportunity to, if the BBC rings you up and say, do you want to come on Question Time, or should we be engaging in mainstream if they're willing to platform us now that the tide is kind of changing towards Israel?
I mean, I personally think we shouldn't be collaborating with the mainstream media in any shape or form, because I think that is not strategic. I think that the corporate media will go back to performing its traditional function sooner or later. And there's a bit of a blip at the moment where they're telling a little bit more of the truth about the reality of Israel than they did a month ago. But they'll go back to the business as usual very soon. And I think the real task for us is to keep championing independent media, to take advantage of this sort of opened political space to get more of the truth out there among the public. So people do need to know the extent to which the UK has been supporting Israel. All those things that I mentioned to you before about those various aspects of military cooperation. People need to know that. There needs to be in future, there will need to be an historical knowledge of what Britain did to support this genocide. We can't let ministers off the hook. The other thing is I think we have to keep pushing for ministers to be held to account for their complicity in war crimes. Admittedly, that's very difficult in Britain because the system is set up to enable impunity for ministers. But I think we should keep raising it. I think we should keep saying that Keir Starmer, David Lammy, John Healey, these people should be held accountable for their complicity in genocide. And the more and more people that hear that, the more it will discredit those people in future, and maybe the more in future it will build pressure on other ministers to believe that they will be held accountable perhaps one day.
Why do you think the tide is changing now? Is it a case of public pressure, which has obviously been a big part, people going to protest, people not stop talking about this at all? Or is it to do with, somebody suggested this recently, they're afraid that they might be held accountable, that they could be, in an international legal perspective, our ministers could legally be held accountable for this. Which one do you think it is right now?
I think that is a genuine fear in Whitehall. It's very interesting how they do dress up their arguments behind international law. And it's very interesting that the British have never accepted that Israel has been committing violations of international law in the area of selling arms, in the area of selling arms to
Israel. At
risk,
because they keep using.
Yeah. So they've never, and I think that is absolutely about protecting ministers from future accountability for war crimes. And it was the same during the bombing of Yemen, with the Saudi bombing of Yemen, where Britain was supplying Saudi Arabia with arms, knowing that Saudi Arabia were committing war crimes. The British refused to acknowledge that they were part of the coalition that was undertaking that bombing. And again, I think the reason was they were protecting ministers from future prosecution from war crimes. But I think the immediate reason why the media have taken a slightly more critical stance of Israel is because they've realized that Israel is off the leash and they're a PR disaster. They've been supporting this state for a very long time. They've invested quite a lot in backing up this state. They've been apologizing for them throughout the genocide. Things have now become so extreme, with Netanyahu talking about the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and Smotrich, talking completely genocidal language. I mean, it's absolutely clear that these people are off the scale. And so it's really bad PR. It's bad PR for anyone who supports Israel. So I think that they are worried that the Israeli project, the Zionist project in Palestine, is under massive pressure and is failing. It's become an international pariah, and it's about time to speak out so that they can eventually regain some international kind of respect for that pariah state.
So before we wrap up, obviously I would recommend anybody going to read your stuff at Declassified. Is there anyone else out there that you would recommend people to go look at their work on this issue or similar issues? Anyone that you look up to?
Well, apart from Declassified, I mean, yeah, there are definitely some very good articles being done all the time at Middle East Eye, and I think, as I mentioned, Middle East Monitor. I mean, I think they're the sort of the two organisations in the UK that kind of really stand out in terms of written analysis, and I would suggest going there. But I think the key thing is for people to have a kind of a plethora of sources to go to, a plurality of places to go. I'm hoping that the days when people just buy their newspaper in the morning and that's where they get their news, or they watch the news on TV from one source and that's where they get their news, those days need to be over. You know, people need to consult a
agree.
variety of sources. It's the only way of getting different perspectives on things, and the only way of stopping you becoming brainwashed.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. That was a great conversation. And we're going to move on to our next guest in a few minutes, I think. So we'll probably take a short break.
Welcome back to Turn Left live at Media Democracy Festival. Really glad to be sat here again. We just had Lewis Aaron with Mark Curtis from Declassified UK. Really good stuff, really interesting conversation. I do apologise with some of the tech issues at the beginning, but we are a voluntary organisation. I am going to shamelessly plug ourselves. So if you want to help out, you can go to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support. You can give us a one-off donation or a monthly contribution. However, we're not here to talk about ourselves. We are here at a Media Democracy Festival to talk to other people. And with me now is Tom Chivers from Media Reform Coalition. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes, thank you for having me. And thank you for teaming up with us for this year's MDF. It's been fantastic.
The pleasure is all ours, I have to say. It's been really, really good energy, really buzzing energy. First off, for our audiences, tell us, what is the Media Reform Coalition?
Yeah, so the Media Reform Coalition, we're a research and campaign group. We've been around since 2011 in the wake of the phone hacking scandal, looking at all of the issues and abuses and harms of corporate media power, trying to work out the solutions, researching what's wrong with the media, and trying to find solutions to how to fix it. So we look at how to make the BBC a much more effective public service broadcaster that's less captured by corporate and political elites. We try to hold the corporate press to account, deal with concentrations of ownership, deal with the onslaught of big tech and the harms that's having. So we sort of have a broad interest across all different dimensions of what's wrong with the media in the UK. And I think our kind of, the catchphrase that we've been sort of generating over the last couple of years is that many, many people know that there's something deeply wrong with the media we have in this country, but not many people tend to think that it's something we can actually change, that it's something we can organise differently, that we can have a different media which works differently, works more democratically, works more in the public interest. So that's where we sort of stand as an organisation, is trying to find the research and the solutions and the policies and the organisation that can work towards a more independent, accountable and democratic media.
There's lots of policies I would love to discuss, but something very interesting you said there, which is there is a widespread feeling with the mainstream media that it's corrupt, it's dishonest. I think we have the lowest trust in the media in Europe. Not surprisingly, that's not just the BBC though, that's corporate media, the print press, all these things. I know it's a very complex issue, but what is one of the biggest things you think is wrong with our media?
I think at the core of it is the crisis we've had in this country for many, many decades, and it's the crisis of concentrated media ownership. It is the fact that the main sectors of our media are mostly owned by a tiny handful of giant corporations. And, you know, your viewers and most people will know the list of names. DMG Media, owned by Lord Rothermere, who's a Tory peer and an unaccountable, untaxed elite. News UK, owned by the Murdoch family, which is at the core of so many things and abuses and harms that have gone wrong in the British media. Reach, the publishing giant, which owns not just the Daily Mirror and the Daily Express, but hundreds and hundreds of local newspaper titles, which it has allowed to collapse through cuts and consolidation, getting rid of journalists, shutting down titles in local communities. So we think of the media in the UK as this sort of space that should be about a diversity of views, empowering our democracy, giving us all a space to know what's going on in the world, to hold the powerful to account. But because of the major corporations which dominate it and the political and the market influence that gives them, that for me is what sits above all of these issues and deep challenges and complaints and criticisms that people have of the media, is that it is all under this umbrella of we only have a tiny handful of groups who own it and run it, and that gives them immense power over who gets to say something, who gets to make something. You know, we're not just talking about news, we're talking about cultural production, entertainment, things that you can just sit down and watch and enjoy on your TV or on your tablet. All of that space, so many different dimensions of the media are just captured by a concentration of a handful of media owners. And I think all of the issues with regulation and standards and abuses and biases and elite capture and all these things that we know about the media, they stem from that corporate capture. They stem from the way that this institution, this core democratic institution that's supposed to support all of us, is owned by a tiny handful of billionaires and media moguls.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people recognise is the power of the corporate media. It is held by a very few amount of people. It's the same in the economy, right? It's a very top-down approach. I think when we talk about the BBC, though, because I was with Tom Mills earlier on today, he's done some really good work on the BBC, and people would say, okay, well, the BBC isn't corporate media, it's something else. So what is it that's wrong with the BBC and wrong with the corporate media, apart from, yes, ownership? But what else is there? Is there a cultural issue? Is there an issue where, I mean, what we do know, for example, is that the majority of journalists, mainstream media journalists, are privately educated, for example. So I want to know what your thoughts on the crossover between the BBC and the corporate media.
Yeah, I think it's that elite capture element, right? It's that the people who are actually in our media producing stuff, finding news, reporting news, are all from a very narrow, self-selecting, identical set of people. They're all typically white, upper class, very wealthy, from wealthy backgrounds. They all know each other from the same schools. They've all been to university with one another. The issue of the revolving door in media, the way that you can have senior journalists becoming senior political advisors in the heart of 10 Downing Street, then going back to being journalists when that particular prime minister's lost office. So I think it's a personnel issue. It's that actually the people who are there in front of the microphone or there behind the keyboard writing stuff in newspapers are from a very, very small, unrepresentative set of the general public, and yet they claim to be speaking for the general public. And this has been an issue in the media for as long as it's existed, really. It's at the core of, and again, it's difficult for me to not say that it's about ownership, because it's about, as has always been said, people own media to have power without responsibility. They want that ability to influence public opinion, to have a backdoor access to political elites, political leaders, to corporate power. And that is reflected in the type of people they choose. I mean, it's the Noam Chomsky thing, right? If you wouldn't be in that chair if you weren't saying the right things, if you weren't the right kind of person. So it's that interaction between the corporate power, but then the social elite power of all these people who know one another within the media. And of course, you'll always have people saying, oh, well, this person, they may have come from that background, but they don't believe that same stuff. But you can't have that same innate connection to the real interests of working class people or black and minority ethnic people or trans people if your entire life has only been known as, I'm part of an elite set of media people. And you may have the right kind of views on those things. You may have a kind of progressive and left-wing mindset about those things. But if you're still from that same space, then the media isn't being as open and diverse as representative as it needs to be. So it's about the personnel, the people within the media that are just as much an issue as the corporate power and the concentrated ownership.
If I was Elon Musk, and I don't really want to think too much about
No.
it, but if I was Elon Musk sat right here, I'd say, but Tom, we've got the solution. Twitter. I'm going to call it Twitter. I don't call it X, right? It's democratic media. Anyone can upload their content. They can do what they like. We have finally taken on the establishment legacy media. And, Elon Musk literally used that term, legacy media. So what's the problem? We've got social media now, right? Is that not democratic?
Yeah. Well, this is what we have just published in our new Who Owns the UK Media report, which is a sort of statistics fact file of who owns how much of the media in different spaces, and not just national newspapers and TV stations, but also online platforms. And we know that Google, Meta, and X Corp are the big players in the online space, right? All of our shared online spaces, the vast majority of platforms or technologies you're going to be using are owned by a handful of billionaires and big tech bros. But that's not just market power in the sense of they own a lot of it, but what we've seen from research and analysis of what kind of news is successful online. What is it that these platforms who have algorithms and recommended feeds and try to tell you this is the news you want to see, they are not broadly recommending radical alternative left-wing things. They are primarily promoting and cementing the reach and influence of the already dominant big newspaper groups. So of the most read news websites in the UK, of the top 50, 40% of their reach is owned by the same three companies that dominate the national newspapers. So big tech and the establishment mainstream media are working hand in glove to cement these same viewpoints, these same news stories, these same journalists. At the heart of, as you say, it's meant to be a democratic, participatory space. We have all these amazing technologies that allow us to connect with people in a way that was never possible before. But because of the corporate big tech ownership of it, all of that kind of democratic, liberatory potential has been snatched away, and it's just turned into a space to allow the same dominant corporate interests, media interests, political interests, to cement their reach online.
Well, I mean, that's interesting you said that because, in the early stages of the internet, people were very optimistic. They would say, yes, this is a new democratic platform, shall we say. It really, it felt revolutionary, right? I now wonder myself, and this sounds quite ironic since turn left is social media, I do think, was the rise of the internet a good thing for these kinds of spaces? Because, yeah, you've got some kind of means of communication, well, you have excellent means of communication, but we haven't seen this rise in democratic media. In fact, not only have we got even more corporate capture of social media, we've now got rise of extreme misinformation and lies. Now, don't get me wrong, the reason why we exist, the reason why you exist, is because the legacy media and the BBC, we think there's an inherent bias to it, right? But what we've got now is complete and utter lies. So does it mean that, did something go wrong in that process, or were we blind to what could come? Because, I mean, I don't know about you, I'm not feeling overly optimistic about the role of social media at the moment, given that Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, bought Twitter, and he lost money for it, but he gained political capital and power from it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think we still have to recognise that the technologies we have now, in terms of our individual ability to express ourselves to people across the world in ways that were never possible before, I do think that is a net positive. The fact that those platforms and those spaces are still captured by the same corporate power that exists across the media and across the economy is obviously just part of a broader dilemma that we have with democratic and political organisation across the world. Right, so it's all tied up within those same processes. What I do think is we need, as an alternative, as a solution to how do we get ourselves out of this muck, this mire that we're in, I think we have to look to what are the pieces of these different technologies and these different media spaces that have been developed over the decades, and think, well, how could we piece something together using the opportunities of these technologies and using these principles of journalistic expression and democratic engagement and diversity and representation? What could we build as an alternative to do that? So that's a starting place for things like Turn Left and for many other organisations in the Independent Media Association, organisations that are regulated by Byline, people who recognise that the system we have now is broken, but actually we can build something better. There isn't an inherent natural inevitability to particular media technologies or particular kinds of newspapers leading to democratic harms. That's a result of political choices. That's a result of the inability or the cowardice of political leaders to face up to the corporate power of the press, of big tech, of large broadcasting companies, of the inability of politicians to not treat the BBC as something
or unwillingness as well, really.
Unwillingness.
Mostly that, let's be honest.
Yeah. So it's a challenge for us in this broader movement of people who want to think about how do we transform the media, how do we build something better, is finding that starting point of, well, what institution can we start with? Where do we start from? Is it about building up grassroots organisations? Is it about trying to militate for top-down structural change in the organisation of the media? And for us as the Media Reform Coalition, you've got to do both at the same time. You've got to try and build alternatives and still try and deal with the harms and democratic abuses of the media system we have now.
I mean, I think a lot of people would look at this and they'll say, yes, these are important conversations, good analysis, you're doing these workshops, fantastic, but people are turning around and saying, but what are we going to do? It's very easy to say, this is what's wrong with our media, we need more democratic accountability, but what does that look like? So, for example, Turn Left is a small organisation, it's completely voluntary, and we rely on algorithms and social media. Now, a few years back, Novara Media's YouTube channel disappeared for a week. There are other people whose income has been completely destroyed because at the end of the day, they're still captured by the corporate interests. So I think it's, we all agree that we need to build alternatives, build independent media. But I think the question comes from that is, but how do we do it? I mean, how does Turn Left grow when, one, again, it's voluntary, there's no income for it, on a platform which is still held by the oligarchs? I think people, and I know it's very difficult because this is why we have these workshops, but people want answers.
Yeah. No, I think, and it's a bit of a cop-out answer to say we've got to keep having these conversations, right? We've had a really fantastic Media Democracy Festival today. It's been great to have you here. It's been great to have so many amazing speakers and people asking amazing questions, but that doesn't stop today. What we don't want to do as an organisation is sit back and say, well, we had a fantastic festival today, we'll see you again in a year, right? We want to take the energy from today, recognise that there are people who have come here with perspectives and ideas that we're not aware of, but we've also helped to kind of educate and inform people about perspectives or policy solutions that they might not be aware of. And it's about keeping that communication going, keeping those, just having conversations with friends and saying, well, we can see everything that's going wrong in politics and we can see how screwed up our media is. What can we do about it? How could we as a group of friends or a network or a campaign group actually do something? I think just, if you don't start having those conversations, you're not going to get anywhere. I don't want to take this defeatist attitude that says that, oh, well, if you just stop reading the Daily Mail and you find alternative sources and everything will be fine. Because all those harms, all of those racist, anti-Muslim, xenophobic, pro-austerity headlines and front pages and BBC News stories will keep happening whether you're watching those shows or reading those newspapers or not. So recognising that there can be something different, having conversations with people, it's a hard slog. It's not going to happen overnight. But it started here today. It started when you started Turn Left. It started our last Media Democracy Festival. It's starting this year. bringing more and more people into that space, keeping that conversation going, bringing in politicians who are slowly but surely recognizing this can't go on. We're heading towards the collapse of trust in institutions, trust in democracy, not just for sort of radical people who know the issues, but the general public are turning off from institutions that they might have seen as a core part of our democracy and our nation. If we don't start having conversations with those people in particular, then we're heading down a very dark path. But we've got to have positive solutions, and that's what we try to offer.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, this is we're at a crisis point where you can't keep things the way they are because they're going to get worse. And I think you're right when we say, let's talk about democratic media. It's not just, this radical leftist idea. It's the interests of democracy widely. We need a functioning media. I want to talk to you, though, about the MDF more broadly. Can you tell me about the energy today, the sorts of people we've been speaking, what are the ideas you've heard? Of course, we are reporting for the first time from MDF. Hopefully, many more to come.
Absolutely.
But tell me about the energy.
Consider yourself booked for next year already.
Well, that's
Don't worry about
we've already
that.
got it in the calendar.
Yes.
My really busy calendar.
We haven't got one in the calendar yet, so you're ahead of us in planning it.
Oh, good. We're number
you
one.
can set the date. No, it's been fantastic today. I mean, we've had such a fantastic turnout. We had Sangeeta Maiskar as our opening speaker, who was absolutely brilliant. Obviously, she's been in the news a lot over the last year and has made a very powerful statement in recent days about the situation she's in, which I don't want to kind of preempt on here, but you've spoken to her earlier today. So that was a really, really fantastic opening to the day, and think, these are, of course she was at the top of the media, but these are the human consequences of this captured system we have, right? Is a journalist who was speaking out against great injustices and holding power to account is now no longer on the air for doing that. And it's like, what a bizarre situation to be in, where the people who were supposed to be supporting, all of the kind of people at the top of the media who say, we've got to support free journalism, we've got to support free expression, and as soon as that happens, they turn their backs on a journalist who's done exactly that. So hearing from Sangeeta talk about that and that experience and what's really at the core of journalism was such a fantastic opening. Since then, we've had really good panels on how to challenge the power of big tech, like we've been discussing, how to challenge the problems of media ownership and what we call kind of oligarch UK, the way that the UK's media is basically an oligarchy owned by a few handful of people. We've got an amazing panel going on downstairs right now about bitterness and isolation in the online media space. So the fact that we do have these technologies, but they're so dominated by abuse and harm and hate and, causing, people taking their own lives from the experiences they've had on social media. What can we do about that, both as a political action, as a path of reform? So the energy's been amazing. We've got just in the other room over the corridor a workshop going on right now, which is full to the brim. People can't fit in the room from the energy and excitement people want to bring to it. So it's just as a space to... I keep using this quote from Tony Benn, because he used to go to the Tolpuddle Festival in Dorset, where I'm from. And every time he'd stand up on the podium and he'd say, I come here every year to recharge my batteries. And I think that's what I hope we've achieved here at the Media Democracy Festival, is all these people who are watching the things that are going wrong in our media and maybe feeling a bit of despair of, this is all really bad and these platforms are really horrible and harmful and we need alternatives. Hopefully by coming to the MDF today and sharing some of these interviews, we can recharge people's batteries and make them aware that an alternative is possible, and this is where we start.
I really like that, because I think, and especially when it ties into with online spaces, people feel quite lonely. Getting physical and getting into these events in person is really important. Yeah, it recharges your battery. I've seen the energy today. It's been fantastic. And I think when you think of a media democracy festival, does that appeal to the mainstream audience? And, well, the turnout suggests that there's a lot of hunger for that.
Yeah.
Tom, I really appreciate you giving me your time. I know you're a very busy man. You've got lots of other workshops and ushering around to do.
It's been nice to sit down for a time.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
all day, so it's good.
now you're back on your feet, so we've given you the time to sit down and talk. But Tom, it's been really, really good. I thank you for joining. That does conclude our stream. We said we're going to do 2 streams today. We managed to do it just about. We've got some exciting interviews to show you, which have been pre-recorded, which is going to be going out in the next week or 2. But that is all we have time for today. Again, thank you for Tom, and thank you for the Media Reform Coalition and the MDF. It's been a pleasure. And I'm Curtis Daly, and I'll see you next time.